So welcome everybody to our spring webinar, Canadian Slavery and Its Legacies, a conversation with Charmaine A. Nelson. My name is Zoe Shaw. I'm the Administrative Services Coordinator at the Thomas More Institute, as well as the moderator for tonight's event. I'm happy to represent TMI, as well as our interview committee, which plans and organizes our seasonal interviews with notable speakers in the liberal arts. I'd like to begin first by noting that while our panelists and our participants in this webinar are dispersed worldwide, the Thomas More Institute is located in Montreal, which is part of Kanien'kehá:ka territory. We would also like to acknowledge that these lands have a long history with and stewardship by many Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. Tiohtià:ke, or Muniang, or Montreal, is historically an important meeting place for several Indigenous nations. Through our programming or through individual research, we invite everyone to join us in understanding more about the histories of the different lands we live on and demonstrating respect for and collaboration with the caretakers of these lands. Founded in 1945, the Thomas More Institute has for 76 years been providing adults of all ages opportunities to cultivate their curiosity about wide-ranging questions rooted in a variety of fields. TMI is a secular, liberal arts academic institution that offers university-level discussion courses, as well as other opportunities for lifelong learning. Our academic year is currently coming to a close, but please do join our newsletter or follow us online to keep updated about our upcoming programming, as this also includes summer activities and next year's course calendar. So tonight's webinar will take place for 2 hours. First hour or so will be dedicated to an interview between representatives of the Thomas More Institute and Professor Charmaine A. Nelson. And then we will turn to our audience for a Q&A with Dr. Nelson. If you're on Zoom right now, move your cursor or tap your screen to see the toolbar at the bottom or the top of your display, and you'll see the Q&A button. And you can enter questions there at any time throughout the event. And I'll pose as many of them as we have time for to Dr. Nelson during the Q&A in the second hour. The chat is disabled today and we won't be able to see or hear you, but we really do welcome your thoughts through the Q&A. We're recording this event tonight, and so if you'd like to rewatch it or share it with a friend, you'll be able to do so with a link provided in a follow-up email that you'll receive tomorrow. It also has an invitation to give us some feedback. So I'll also note that the content of this webinar does include discussions and representations of the violence and brutality that make up histories of slavery and racism. This includes mental, physical, and sexual abuse. These things are difficult but inevitable, so please be aware of your own limits when choosing to participate in this forum. I'll first give a quick thanks to Morgan Gagnon, who's here as a bit of technical backup tonight. And now I'll introduce our interviewers and interviewee, and we can get started. Shahnaz Chuksi has an undergraduate degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science and a PhD from McGill. She taught for many years at Vanier College in Montreal, and she's been with the Thomas More Institute since 2015. Joseph Vietri is a PhD candidate from Concordia University. He's been at Thomas More for several years, designing and leading courses. During this time, he's also been a member of the curriculum committee. And of course, Charmaine A. Nelson is a professor of art history and a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Transatlantic Black Diasporic Art and Community Engagement at Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, University in Halifax, Canada, where she's also the founding director of the first ever institute focused on the study of Canadian slavery. Prior to this appointment, she worked at McGill University for 17 years. Nelson has made groundbreaking contributions to the fields of visual culture of slavery, representation and race, and Black Canadian studies. She's published 7 books, including The Color of Stone, Sculpting the Black Female Subject in 19th Century America, Slavery, Geography and Empire in 19th Century Marine Landscapes of Montreal and Jamaica, and Towards an African Canadian Art History, Art, Memory and Resistance. She's actively engaged in lay audiences through her media work, including ABC, CBC, CTV, City TV News, Boston Globe, BBC One, and PBS. She blogs for the Huffington Post Canada and writes for The Walrus. And in 2017, she was the William Land Mackenzie King Visiting Professor of Canadian Studies at Hartford University. So I'll hand it off to our three speakers tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. Before we get started, I just want to thank Brian McDonough for the kind invitation, and also Carol Fiedler, and my thanks to Dr. Chokshi and to Mr. Vietri for this interview. Thanks to all of you for attending.
So we'd start by congratulating you, Dr. Nelson, on your appointment as founding director of the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And the question I have for you is, given that the Institute is housed in the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design,
Mm-hmm.
how do you envisage using the arts
Mm-hmm.
to promote an understanding of the lived experiences of Black slaves in the 17th and 18th centuries?
Right, right. So most people, I think, would initially think it's counterintuitive to have an Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery at an art and design university. But for me, it's absolutely precisely where it should be, because one of the things is, most of you probably know through my introduction, I'm actually an art historian. So I should point out that of the humanities and arts disciplines, art historians have been one of the last sets of scholars to the table to discuss and to research issues of transatlantic slavery and of course of Canadian slavery as well. I am actually the only art historian in Canada with a tenure or tenure track job who, or now the second, my student just got a job at Concordia, who teaches and works in the field of transatlantic slavery. Okay, so dominantly is a historical field, historians, anthropologists, etc. Now, why an art school makes this such an important endeavor is because from year to year, we want to start to welcome fellows. This year, we'll be welcoming our first cohort of 2 artists in residence and 2 MA fellows. And why it's so important to have the artists at the table is that if we all think about it, the way that most of the lay public will come to an understanding of transatlantic slavery is through the arts. It'll be them visiting, let's say, an art exhibition at a museum. Right now, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam just launched a very big, important, exhibition on the history of the Netherlands and slavery. Or typically, we come at it through the lens of either the documentary or the narrative film. Now, if you think about it, recently, it's been really interesting that we've had a spate of very high budget, blockbuster Hollywood movies about slavery that did very well at the box office too, and very well in terms of awards. And I'm talking about Lincoln, 12 Years a Slave, and Django Unchained. That's not normal. Okay, but the thing is, when you think about most of the movies that many of us have seen about slavery, they're about slavery in the Caribbean, in the northern parts of South America, a place like Brazil, or the American South. There is no film yet on Canadian slavery, documentary or narrative. So if we're going to reach the general public and change a knowledge and develop an understanding of this 200-year history of Canadian slavery, fundamentally, the artists have to be put out front, because the artists who reach the bulk of the lay public.
Thank you.
So an idea which comes out of your work, and particularly some talks you've given in the past, is the idea of the absentee of the Black experience in Canadian history.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think the arts in particular can be helpful to rectify this amongst the Canadian youth, especially today when the young are always on tablets, or it's a digital age for them? You've mentioned a few movies, but what other ways do you think the arts can be useful to rectify this idea of absentee?
Well, okay, to your point, Joseph, I think it's something that we have to recognize is we have a 200-year history of transatlantic slavery under 2 empires in the nation, France and Britain. And it's not taught at any level of our curriculum, from kindergarten to grade 12 in terms of high school. It's not taught in Cégep in Quebec, and it's not taught in universities. So, and literally there's about 5 people like myself who are employed at Canadian institutions who routinely produce research and or teach about Canadian slavery. So we're in a dire situation here. We are way behind other regions in terms of the scope, the complexity, and the amount of research that we're generating on Canadian slavery. It's appalling, actually. And as we get more into conversation, you'll see that this is not about a dearth in the archive. It's about a lack of boots on the ground. It's a lack of people doing the research. So Joseph, to your point, again, how do we reach the majority of people, and how do we engage students and young people and people in high school, for instance, in these histories? And I'm one that I really want to point out, this is something we should be teaching in elementary school. This is not something to just start to introduce when people are 17 in grade 11. Okay, and if you look to the United States, for all their flaws, there's a plethora of literature written for children in the elementary school age group and the high school age group about American slavery. So they're already doing it, right? If you try to find those similar books on Canada, typically you'll come across books on the Underground Railroad. So we need to think outside the box. What about podcasts? What about now the explosion of the digital humanities, right? What kind of documents, works, including manuscripts, printed documents, the historical artifacts too, should we be digitizing and putting online, and what formats will the students be able to engage with that? How are we building curriculum those ways? And also, yes, to think about things like art production, theater, screenwriting, all those types of things. We can engage with the narrative of not just transatlantic slavery, but Canadian slavery. And here's the thing, we don't have to recreate the wheel, because again, it's already being done and been done in the USA, especially focused on the southern states, in the Caribbean, and again, in places like the northern parts of South America.
So maybe we could discuss the historical framework that you work on, particularly advertisements for slaves published in newspapers. There we often find terms or names being used, particularly what you identify as a creolization, right? You identify it as a process of becoming. And this really does affect our modern day understanding of terms. For example, the umbrella term Black. This is a term which has its own historical significance, and it covers a very diverse people from various locations around the world. What do you think the positives and the negatives of such a general and broad term has on our perception of the history?
That's a great question. So here's the thing. A term like Black, white, Asian, on their face, they're neither good or bad. The problem is that the term Black has been linked to stereotypes, including stereotypes of lack of civility, brutishness, animalization, lascivity in terms of sexuality. And all that was produced in and through, Joseph, slavery, the 400-year legacy of slavery. That's an outcome then, those stereotypes that are of course not true, because you can see too, they're polarizing, right? So typical stereotypes of Black men, they're either timid, docile, like a so-called Uncle Tom, that stereotype, or they're sexually lascivious, they're aggressive, they're rapists, especially targeting white women. So those are polar opposite things that are said to exist all the time in Black men. So it's impossible, right? If you break down any stereotype, they're impossible because they cannot coexist, right? So they actually make no sense. But what we have to understand is, in the process, the 400-year process of slavery, white people in Europe, as they're attempting to build their empires in the Americas, had to justify the enslavement and expropriation of millions of Africans. And we have to understand here that this is a unique horror of slavery, that forms of slavery had transpired before, forms of slavery have transpired since. But what makes transatlantic slavery uniquely horrific is that it is in and through slavery that the concept of race as a biological category of humanness that could be organized in a hierarchy with white people always at the top, that's when race was created, through the 400-year history of slavery. And incidentally, very importantly, it's only Black Africans who were deemed to be always already enslavable. Now, if we go back to the west coast of Africa, where the slave ships would have been loading up to go off into the Americas, enslaved captains going onto the ships were not Black. They had specific national and ethnic identities. the force of what we call creolization produced Blackness in the Americas, them being shoved together, being forced to figure out how to communicate, being told by the slave owning classes, stop playing your drum, stop speaking your language. I'm going to strip your first name. I'm going to impose my last name on you. I'm going to make sure you're not literate. I'm going to make sure you cannot practice your culture and social practices anymore. That force, right? Because for the enslaved, think of this, Joseph, for the enslaved, creolization, as we name it, the contact in the Americas of whites, indigenous people, and Black people. For the enslaved, it's always under duress. It's about what the slave owning classes prohibit you and forbid you and make illegal in your life. And it's about what you can, in clandestine ways, still practice. So the term Black in itself is not a bad term, but Black people then are the descendants of those who survived, the 12 million who survived the Middle Passage, who got off the slave ships on the side of the Americas and then went on to have children. We, their descendants, then were named Black because then we lost under that force aspects of the specificity of our national and ethnic heritage. And we became something else. So the term Black in and of itself, Joseph, is not a bad thing. What I'm arguing in that article is I want us in Canada to remember what were the ingredients of Blackness to fight against those stereotypes and to fight against the idea that Black people are all just the same, right? And anybody who knows Black people, knows the diversity of Black culture today in Canada, knows that's absolutely not true, because we're talking about African Americans, African Canadians, African Caribbeans, dominantly from Franco and Anglo islands, African born people, and more in Canada, African Latinos, right? Black people coming from the Dominican Republic, from Venezuela, from Peru, etc. So we are as complex today as we were back then, but we don't know that history of complexity, Joseph, because people don't even know the dimensions of slavery and then how heterogeneous those populations were. And that's something I was trying to get at in that article.
So that leads to another question, Charmaine. In your article, you are focusing on the runaway slave advertisements in the period 1765 to 98.
Mm-hmm.
And I quote briefly, you say a key marker of the enslaved Black population in 18th century Quebec was its profound heterogeneity. Mm-hmm. You also add, the advertisements provide for us a window into the lives and worlds of the enslaved. So could you briefly open this window for us and show us some of the key markers of the heterogeneity and the variety of the Black population?
For sure. So I'm going to screen share with you now, and I'll also address some of Joseph's initial question in that regard as well. Okay, so I hope you can all see that. So first of all, I just wanted to introduce you a bit to the nature of the documents that we as scholars who research transatlantic slavery, and of course Canadian slavery falls into that, that we routinely work with. They are not the same documents that you would work with if you were a historian, art historian, someone working on free people in historical moments, okay? And I'll explain why. So for instance, a dominant type of manuscript, handwritten, often one-of-a-kind document you find in tropical plantation regions like Jamaica is a yearly head count or a ledger where the so-called heads of Negroes, and this is the terminology that was used, as if similar to heads of cattle, okay? And this is not an accident because Black people were considered subhuman, animal, and livestock. So they're counting here at the beginning of the year how many Black people, aka Negroes, they have on the plantation. Why? To know how many new enslaved people need to be purchased, and to know if they're having any success with so-called natural increase, meaning is this Black population on this plantation, Hope Plantation, reproducing itself? And this was a serious question because, of course, the nature and brutality of corporal punishment and the horror and backbreaking nature of the labor resulted in people being worked to death. Okay, and this was a strict economic calculation where slave owners would think, is it better for me to treat my enslaved people with some care, feed them properly, clothe them properly, not abuse them through corporal punishment in the way that I have been doing, so that they can reproduce? Or is it cheaper for me to go back to Africa and buy new enslaved Africans? Okay, it was an economic calculation for these slave owners. It had nothing to do with seeing the sanctity of life of the enslaved. So here I want to point out, to Joseph's point, they're tracking in this column here, A and C is referring to African-born people, and Creole meaning anybody born in the Americas. In this case, Black people born in the Americas, most of them would have been born in Jamaica. Interestingly, the most valued enslaved people on this ledger are the top 21 males who are the artisan class. And you note that they're listing their skills: carpenter, ditto; mason, ditto; cooper, blacksmith, doctor, driver. Okay, and drivers were an augment to the overseer's corporal punishment, but they were enslaved Black men who were given the power to use corporal punishment on their fellow slaves, their fellow enslaved people. Interestingly, of these 21, the majority are Creole, telling us what? Who's trusted by that planter class, by the whites on the island, not the Africans, because the Africans have a memory of their freedom. Okay, and they were deemed to be more resistant, excuse me. So here you can see these ledgers often go across many pages, because typically in Jamaica, we're dealing with plantations, thousands of acres in size, with hundreds of enslaved people on each. So in such a world too, you can imagine that many of those African people were from the same ethnicities, and could, if they were able to do this in secret many times, find a way to still maintain and practice their specific ethnic specificity, okay, their Igbo-ness, their Congo-ness, etc. Here we move to Canada. A bill of sale is a typical type of document that we try to find for an enslaved person to try to track their life and who was owning and exchanging them. In this case, we have a bill of sale from Halifax, and you'll notice that one of the people doing the exchanging of the enslaved Black woman, named here was a Negro named Dinah, is a reverend. Okay, so Christians in the period of slavery did not see Christianity as incompatible with slavery. But at the same time, many Christian people were abolitionists. They were on the side of the opposition of slavery, okay? So Christianity was being manipulated to suit the ideological ends of various groups of white people who were on both sides of the issue of slavery. In this case, you can have a sense of the horror of the objectification of enslaved people in Canada. So we have an auction ad in here. Yes, enslaved people were both auctioned publicly and sold privately in Canada. This one from Nova Scotia, and you can see that this Black man here, named as a Negro, is lumped in with a bunch of inanimate objects, right? Quantity of salt in a barrel, boats, fishing nets, etc., and Negro man. So what is really, I think, gut-wrenching for us today is to understand that this auctioneer didn't even feel he had to name this man or to specify his age or any of his physical attributes or labor or skills. Okay, it was enough just to name him as a Black person, an enslaved Black man. And yes, enslaved children were frequently separated from their parents and from their elders in community. Slave owners did not really pay a lot of attention to the preservation of Black family. And actually, we understand from a lot of manuscript documents, personal correspondence, and business correspondence of slave owners, that they routinely weaponized the threat of family separation as a way to force enslaved people to do what they wanted them to do. Okay, they'd say, if you don't do X, Y, Z, I will sell your son from you, I will sell your aunt from you, I will ship your grandmother to another plantation, etc. So we're routinely across the Americas, including Canada, finding enslaved children being sold by themselves. And again, the sale ads rarely list the name of the person and any description beyond their age, and routinely saying that they're strong, they're obedient, and often list their skills. Okay, so same thing for this girl here, a Black girl named as a Negro. And Negro, I should point out too, Joseph, could mean several things. Negro was a catch-all term to mean Black, of Black African descent, but Negro also meant someone who was unmixed with other races. So in this case, it could also mean that she was so-called full-blooded Black. She wasn't mixed with Indigenous, she wasn't mixed with white, for instance, okay? Here you can also see, the later we get into the 18th century, the more that the slave owners start to hide and push the printers out front as their go-betweens. So here, inquire of the printer means exactly that. If you want to buy this Black girl, you had to go to the printer of the Nova Scotia Gazette because the slave owner was unwilling at this point to print his or her name, in part because of the rise in abolitionism here, making slavery more and more unpalatable to the broader community. Joshua Major was what you call a West Indian merchant. This is a rather horrifically extraordinary ad where you see that he's bringing in a shipment of enslaved Black people. The term Creole, which I've highlighted for you, actually meant that they were born in the Caribbean, whereas the term was used in the broader transatlantic world to mean any person of any race or ethnicity born in the Americas. In Nova Scotia, it meant born in the Caribbean, a Black person born in the Caribbean. So we know that this ship has come in from, it would have been the Anglophone Caribbean, places like Jamaica, Barbados, etc. Why? Because typically empires only traded with their own colonies, right? It was very rare to have a place like Curacao, which was a so-called free port or an open port. So we can assume that this ship has come in from a place like Jamaica, for instance, and the primary cargo would have been slave-produced crops like rum, sugar, and molasses. Secondarily, they would have had a so-called secondary cargo then of these enslaved people. I want to point out here too, again, we can't assume that any of these people were related. So when you see the two boys here, 12 and 13 years old, likely healthy, well-shaped, again, they're trying to convey that they're healthy, they're in good shape, you can extract a lot of labor from them. And two healthy Negro slaves, 18. We can't assume that the so-called Negro wench is their mother. No. There's a randomness to how slave traders selected who was going to be thrown on the ship and sent north. And there is some evidence that was used as a mode of, again, family separation and punishment. Okay. So the other thing too, I just want to point out here is we have an older male here too, 30 years old. Which is actually quite old for an enslaved person. So when we think of ages today, what is midlife, what is adolescence, throw them out the window for the 18th century and 19th century, throw them out the window entirely for enslaved people who died routinely, prematurely, again, because of labor conditions and because of corporal punishment and because of material deprivation and the lack of proper and differentiated diets. So to Shernaz's important question, this is then the list of things that you typically find in the fugitive slave ad, which are the ads then that slave owners printed when an enslaved person resisted through running away, through flight. Way more detailed than the sale ads. Why? Not because the slave owners invested in describing and identifying and articulating the complexity of the identities of the enslaved people. No. It's because they're going to list anything and everything that allows them to capture the person and drag them back into bondage. Okay, so here you rarely find descriptions that are akin to the slave sale ads. You find way more detail about that person, including, to Shernaz's question, where the person was originally from. So in that article, I pointed out that the minority within the enslaved minority of Black people would have been African-born people like Joe. Now, we can surmise through looking at the ads for African-born people that the typical white slave owner knew nothing about Africa. And how we can surmise that is that ads for African-born people in Jamaica were specific. They listed specific, let's say, bodily practices like scarification, which were aesthetic practices of marking of the body in a communal sense by Africans. They'd also list a specific ethnicity or nation, national identity of the African. They'd say this guy is Congolese or this guy is Igbo who's running away. Not so in Canada. What you find is they'll say born in Africa, or they'll say that he or she has a Guinea accent. Okay? Mm-hmm. So I wanted to think about too, the types of trauma through isolation that someone like Joe in Ireland would have suffered as a minority within the minority, people who survived the Middle Passage, right, that first slave ship passage, who may have been of age to remember multiple African language, to remember the family and community from which they were wrenched, and to not have anyone in a place like Quebec to speak the language to practice their culture. So Ireland here, again, you can see he's named as, how do we know he's African? Speaks English tolerably plain, but no other language except that of his native country, Guinea. Guinea here is a stand-in for Africa. So again, Gilliland doesn't know where Ireland is from, or he's not saying so. Okay. The other group that's dominant is people like Andrew, who are from what would become the United States. So here Crofton is naming Andrew as being born in Maryland. Now I have to point out, why would you even bother to do this? Because Crofton suspects that that's where Andrew might be running back to. Okay, so it's a way not only to name and mark him as having a certain accent, but to say, heads up, he's probably going back there. Why? Because that's where I forced him to leave when I relocated him to Quebec, because again, enslaved people had no control over their mobility. Sharnaz, did you want to jump in with a question there?
No, I think, what about you had Bet in 2 ads, right? The one
Yes.
runaway slave ad and one is a sale ad.
For sure. So I'll go forward because I realize I'm taking too much time here. So just an example here, Nemo from Albany, same things going on, African-American slave person. And again, there would be Caribbean people initially creolized then in the Caribbean. This man or maybe boy, John Thompson, listed as being born in Jamaica. And this an oddity here, Will. Why is it odd? He's speaking Spanish. This is totally atypical for Quebec, where the dominant languages, European languages forced on enslaved people were English and French. So to Sharnaz's important question, I wanted just to highlight Bell, who, previous scholars earlier than me have done amazing work that's really gut-wrenching in looking at how many individual white males owned her in a really condensed period of time. And why that's important to say that they were white males is because the other uniquely horrific thing about transatlantic slavery is that it was deliberately organized in what you call a matrilineal order, meaning any child born to an enslaved female became a slave at birth because she was a slave. So this incentivized rape and sexual coercion, because slave owners understood that to impregnate the female was to make themselves more property. So many white men who were then raping and sexually coercing their enslaved women did not claim their mixed race children as human. They did not free them necessarily. When we see them being freed, typically they're being freed through the mechanism of the will on the white man's deathbed, if at all. So Belle was a mulatto or mulatta, which meant too that she was open to a certain type of sexual violence, because white people in their notions of superiority argued that people who were mixed race, part European, were more beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. Okay, and they deployed this as a universal, but of course, this was their own racist opinion. So people like Belle were typically then forced to work domestic labor, even in places like Jamaica or in the tropics, were in plantation regimes. And they were exposed to certain types of sexual violence because of that notion of their beauty and proximity to white femaleness. Now, I want to highlight here that she's running without shoes and stockings, even in August, is completely abnormal. And that is because slave owners in Canada typically did give proper footwear and proper seasonal footwear to the enslaved. And there's another ad for her running from him in a short period of time too. So we have to ask the question, what is going on in this household that makes this household so intolerable to Belle that she would risk life and limb and clearly here not even have a plan, right? When someone is running with no shoes and stockings, she has not planned that escape. And in comparison, I want to show you here a planned escape, Chloe, who does what? She gets out of a second or higher story window of the residence of Judah Joseph with the help of a ladder and goes off in a canoe with a man who's waiting for her. Do you get this? This is a plan. Chloe had a plan. She had to know where the ladder was, know where to place the ladder, know when Joseph wouldn't be watching in order to do all this. This is diametrically opposed to Belle's escape. Now, Sharnaz, you were asking about this one. This is, again, so much of slavery is so difficult for us to process. This is the only winter escape in Quebec, enslaved woman named Bet, who runs away in her third trimester, being described as big with child and within a few days of her time. What is motivating her to attempt this in March in Quebec? Do we understand how horrific the household must be for her to attempt this? So think of the conditions and think of the nature of the clothing that, of course, the clothing typically secondhand or cast off that the owners are giving to enslaved people. So she goes off into the winter. We know, sadly, that she was caught. The child died. We don't know how, but we know this because there's a court case with her being tried for the murder of the child. So shortly thereafter, she's sold anonymously. Notice that Johnson and Peirce don't list their names, don't list her names. Why? Because this would have been a scandal of the settlement, right? And she would have been positioned as unruly, disobedient, and careless in running off in her third trimester, as opposed to them being vicious, violent, and perhaps, let's think about this, there's a very good chance that one of them was the father of her child, that she was carrying a mixed race child in her womb. And that she would have understood then that that child would have at birth been enslaved like herself, okay? So we need to think about what is motivating such a drastic and dramatic escape in the dead of a Quebec winter. And here, the only case of what we could call, looks like an enslaved family trying to escape together, a man, a woman, and a child, interestingly described as a mulatta or mulatto. And again, I want to suggest to you here the description of the Black man as Negro, of the woman as a mulatto complexion Negro, and the girl, though, as a mulatto, sends a flag up for me and makes me ask, was James Fraser the father of Lydia's child? Was he hunting his own mixed race child in this ad? Okay, and just to conclude, I just want to show you the impunity with which the Canadian slave owners were operating. Here, John Rock in Nova Scotia is unafraid to announce that this girl, Thursday, who's fleeing from his household, has a lump above her right eye. Now, yes, could have been a birth defect or a labor accident, but let's be real, the most logical reason why she had a lump above her eye is that he hit her in the face shortly before she fled. And if so, he was unafraid to declare publicly that she was walking around with a bruise and to use it as a way to catch her. Now, just to end here, Sharnaz, I want to show people how then we can prove or try to find the enslaved person after their flight. One mechanism is to go to the will or the state inventory of the slave owner. Now, this only works if the enslaver, the slave owner, dies before the enslaved person. In this case, that was the case. And very sadly, I was able to prove then that Thursday was caught. Why? Because she ends up in John Rock's estate inventory being sold off to a man, John Bishop, for 20 pounds. Okay. And there's another listing. She was valued at 25 pounds. She was sold for 20. Okay. So then, sadly, again, how we try to find her again would be to pursue John Bishop, not to pursue her, because how enslaved people showing up in the archive, Sharnaz, are through the ledgers, the documents left by the slave owner, sadly.
I have another quick question, since we have a little bit of time for this. Are there any oral histories from the descendants of the Black slaves?
Oh, that's a great question. So typically, okay, there's a whole genre, Sharnaz, that emerges across the Americas, a unique literary genre called the fugitive slave narrative. And these were written by enslaved fugitives, people who ran away, who were successful in staying away, and usually with the help of abolitionists, were able to either write their own stories, like someone like Frederick Douglass, who had gained literacy, or their story would be transcribed usually by a white or a Black abolitionist for them, someone who was literate. Now, sadly, painfully, we have found to date no fugitive narratives for someone who was enslaved in Canada. But we have some oral histories and interviews collected by a man named Benjamin Drew, who came to Canada from the States to interview African Americans after slavery had happened in Canada, right? After the Underground Railroad, to ask them how their life was going in Canada. And interestingly, this is really important. They're like, not so great. They're like, this place is racist. Okay. So we too, what we do in Canada, of course, is teach the Underground Railroad. Yay for us. We were good. We saved all the African Americans. But we lie about that too. We don't lie about the fact that slavery ended in Canada. Racism went nowhere, my friends. Racism went nowhere. And so it's because we have Drew's testimonies, or Drew's collected testimonies of those African Americans, that was exposed. Also, projects like, I think in the 1930s, the United States federal government interviewed the descendants of enslaved people. So these were typically children or grandchildren of people who had been born into slavery. So amazingly, in the States, they have audio recordings of people who are one generation removed talking about slavery. Nothing like that exists to date that we found for Canada.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shanaz.
We know that first names and last names are such a central part of our identities.
Yes.
They don't only confirm our personhood, they also act as a link to our past, to our families, to our roots. What do you think the impact of, particularly in these advertisements, the unnaming of the slaves had, but also the imposition of names onto them? For example, we had the Ireland or
Yes.
Quebec. What do you think this does, or what do you think the impact it had on the slave population?
Joseph, that's such a great question. So here's the thing. What we have to understand too is Africans resisted everything. Enslaved Black people were resisting everything, including being renamed. So what is beautiful is often in an archive like the Fugitive Slave Ads, the slave owners, again, are so desperate to get the people back that they say things that are completely not helpful to them in trying to justify slavery as a so-called civilizing mission, okay? So one of the things, to your point, that comes up is slave owners will say things like, I call him Belfast, but he calls himself Bill. Or I call him Isaac, but he calls himself Charles. But in places, especially more southern places where the slave ships arrived directly from Africa, that didn't happen in Canada. The slave ships didn't come straight from Africa to Canada, but places like South Carolina, Jamaica, they did. What you find are slave owners saying, these people who ran away are still using their African names. Okay, so I'm going to print those too and tell you the name I posed on them. Now, the other level of that in terms of renaming is a form of abuse, Joseph. Okay, so in digging into in the British Library, other ledgers, like the one I showed you for Hope Estate, I came across naming practices that are just abhorrent in places like Antigua. And what I mean by that, they were naming people monkey and trash, okay? So imagine too, they were deliberately, conceptualizing and imposing horrifically humiliating names, which people have to walk around with their whole lives being called monkey and trash, okay? So think about that too. And also in Canada, we find names like Caesar and Hercules being imposed on Black men. And this was a form of racist humor of slave owners because, oh, isn't it so funny that someone so powerless should have the name of a powerful? So you see that again and again too, the names of gods, Greek gods and kings and queens being imposed on people, and things like Belfast and Ireland, I will impose the name of my homeland on you. It's like marking the person with the ethnicity and the nationhood of the slave owner, right? So you just don't mark them physically by whipping them till they're scarred, by branding them in places like Jamaica, right? By putting a slave collar on their neck, but you mark them through the humiliating nomenclature of the first name and stripping the last name. And get this, really think about this. You strip their African last name, you impose the name of the father, usually male slave owner, but you give them none of the benefits of that family connection, of having that imposition of that white person's name, right? It's just, again, a mark of ownership for that enslaved person. And that's why, again, across the Americas, people don't understand this. What are the last names of Black diasporic people in Brazil? They're Portuguese. In the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Cuba, they're Spanish. In a place where my ancestors came from, Jamaica, my last name's Nelson. In many, many cases, these names were the imposed names of some slave owner, right? That we're still living with. And seriously, like, check it out. People say, oh, why don't you go back and get your African name? How? You know how hard it is to do genealogy for Blacks in the diaspora? Because you go, Shanaz, right, and Joseph, and then what? You hit one of those, if you're lucky, you hit a plantation record like Hope Estate. And then what? You have a bunch of first names and age ranges, right? So for many people, they can't even get back to the level of the slave ship. And on the slave ship, the ledgers were worse, more, meaning what? You were adult, female adult, boy and girl going on to the slave ship. And you were literally cargo, and you were insured by the insurance companies, right? It's like, think of where this money went. The insurance company insured you as cargo. You were not a name going onto the slave ship. So it's incredibly difficult too to recuperate even African names beyond a certain point, because the slave owners did such a horrific but good for them, good job at achieving exactly what they wanted, was to strip people of their African identities.
The question I also have now is about the indigenous slave populations existing at the same time as the Black slave population.
Mhm.
Was there any interaction between them? Did they work in similar trades in the domestic area? Any evidence of that?
Great question. So Shernaz, where that for Canada really resonates is New France, which is what Quebec was called under the French until 1760. And then with British conquest, it was renamed Quebec, okay? That is the one province in what would become Canada where both Indigenous people and Black people were enslaved together. In all the rest of Canada, we know Indigenous people were being colonized, but not enslaved under transatlantic chattel slavery. Okay, so there's a distinction to be made there, because in chattel slavery, legally you were deemed to be chattel, or another word for that was mueble, or movable personal property. Under the law, you were no different than the chairs we're sitting on or the tables in front of us. Okay, so in Quebec, of course, we have in New France histories of enslaved people of Indigenous and African descent being enslaved together in the same household. What's going to happen? They become kin, right? Some of them fall in love, they have children together. There would have been a whole group, right? A mixed race population that was not white, that was part Indigenous and part Black. Who's doing research on this? Nobody. Like, I found one person who's doing research on this. And I'm like, please publish something. This is phenomenal and such an anomaly across the Americas, because so many other empires, again, the Portuguese, etc., the Spanish, you know, the Dutch, they colonize Indigenous people, but oftentimes the aristocracy and or the church forbid the white colonizers to enslave Indigenous people, because they assume them to be, or characterize them to be, closer to white than Black people were, right? So they weren't allowed to enslave them. But in Quebec, the French were enslaving both. And get this, the British elsewhere were not enslaving Indigenous people. They show up, and in their Treaty of Capitulation, one of the first things they say is, you can all keep your slaves. And by the way, we're going to take your practice of co-enslaving these two groups of people. So this is very extraordinary. And then people have to understand too, we typically have this idea of Europeans in their moments of imperial conquest of just hating each other and being at war. Not so in terms of slavery. They had each other's backs. That's where they're on the same page. Let's help each other to hold certain groups of people in bondage. And that's exactly what was laid out in the Treaty of Capitulation. So absolutely, Shernaz, there's so much for us to learn there. And in terms of this term creolization too, we see this showing up in the ads, because Joe, for instance, running away, African-born Joe, he's wearing moccasins, right? Bet is wearing an Indian shawl. Like, the creolization is happening too in their culture, including what we'd call then slave dress. What are enslaved people wearing, right? That it's a mix of European, African, because Andrew from Maryland is wrapping his head, West African practice, right? So it's a mix of African preserved practices, Indigenous and European. Extraordinary. And that will stand out once we do the work from what's happening in other places in the Americas.
How do you, maybe we could discuss the differences between Canadian slave lived experience and that in the U.S., where the Americans, are maybe the image that most comes to mind, the big plantations.
Yeah.
How do you think these two experiences differed?
Excellent question. So here's the thing that people need to understand. In the semi-tropical regions like the American South, again, Haiti, Jamaica, Brazil, typically the use that the colonizers and slave owners found in those places were to set up plantations that they could run all year round, because what? The climate allowed for it, right? It's growing season, always. Now, here's the thing that we do in Canada too. We pretend that we were kinder and more benevolent because we didn't have the same plantation system, and because then we actually imported or enslaved less people. That was just purely economics. If these slave owners in Canada could have sustained an all-year plantation system, they would have done it, okay? So they had less slave holding, smaller numbers of enslaved people per household, because they didn't need as many. Because, for instance, you'd have an enslaved person, to your point, Joseph, what is the enslaved person doing? And we can recuperate this from the sale ads, for instance. You might be churning butter one day. You might be mending the slave owner's clothing. You might be making the slave owner's clothing and laundering the slave owner's clothing and baking the bread. And if you're a slave woman, you might be tending to the slave owner's children. You might be having your breast milk stolen. You're forced to be a wet nurse. If you were someone who just have a baby, guess who's going to get fed first? Your enslaved kid or the slave owner's kid, right? So this biological coerced like intimacy, what I call a perverse intimacy, is forced on enslaved people, who are then in Canada often doing both domestic and agriculture or field or outdoor labor. Same person, do you do it all? Because that household might have 2 enslaved people. Whereas what happens, Joseph, in a place like Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, is that you'd have these plantations that became monocrop cultures. They're growing one thing all the time, right? Just cotton, just rice, just tobacco, a place like Jamaica, all sugar all the time, maybe some coffee, right? All right. And because of that, though, if you saw the Hope Ledger, you have different classifications and categories of people with different skill sets who are doing different things, right? Those first 21 men, artisans. They're not in the field. That's why they're so valuable. Blacksmith, right? Blacksmith, cooper, carpenter, the people making the barrels that you ship the rum and sugar out in, those were those first 21 men. They would have been worth the most in terms of their economic value if they were sold. Mm-hmm. Okay. Then below that, what do you have? Field slave, field slave, field slave. So those are people who have to plant, cultivate, harvest, and process that sugar, for instance, on that estate. And then you get specialized again, right? Because when the sugar gets cut down, someone feeds it into the mill, someone extracts the juice, someone, like these plantations, you got to understand, there were small villages. All the factory buildings called works were on that same plantation. So there's a distillery right on the plantation where after they extract the juice, they actually process it into the sugar, molasses, and rum right there. So there's a whole group of then those specialized enslaved people who know how to do those jobs. And then there's the ones who package it and have to take it to the wharf. So you can see there's all these different things. So the thing though, Joseph, I really want to point out, back to Shernaz's questions about enslaved females, it's the males who had the best chance of escaping the fields, because only the males typically were promoted and taken out of the fields to do the artisan work. The females, how they got out of the field, sadly, was to go into the house, would often put them at greater risk for rape and sexual coercion. And often who even got to go into the house, if you were in the American South or a place like Jamaica, were often mixed race enslaved people who were literally related to the planter or the overseer or some other white administrator on the plantation. So it created a hierarchy of complexion, because you'd have the darkest or the darker, the unmixed Black people in the fields, and then the so-called mulatto, Quadroon, Octoroon in the house. Right? So to the extent that, of course, the whole system is designed to make the enslaved people take on these corrupt ideologies about themselves, when did the Black people start to weaponize this nonsense, this complexionism against each other, is a question too, right? And who was able to resist that? If you're born your whole life and your whole life people are saying, you're beautiful because you're light-skinned, and you get to go in the house and you have bigger and better portions of food, how do you, as that domestic enslaved person, treat the African, the literal enslaved person who just got off the ship from Africa? What does that look like? Is something else that we really need to think more about as well, right? How did enslaved people start to play out those hierarchies against each other in really vicious ways?
Do we know, before Shernaz, do we know how these artisanal trades, were these self-learned or were these imposed onto the slaves?
Right, that's a great question. From what I read, again, you'll notice how many of those men on Hope Estate were C's ones, right? They're Creole. All right, so Creole doesn't mean that they're going to be mixed race, but a lot of them would have been mixed race, right? So for instance, the overseer's son from an enslaved field woman, right, who's a mixed race guy, he might have the wherewithal and the power with a planter to say, I don't want my son to be a field slave. Make my son a blacksmith. And that's often how those things were negotiated, right? So, and again, that overseer doesn't own his son because the planter owns the woman, right? But he has some wiggle room there. And depending on whether or not he sees the woman or the son as human, he might try to advocate to free them. Or he might be like, no, that's all I'm doing for you. That's all you get. So in a lot of cases, then, to your point, to be, more direct, Joseph, it's not, no enslaved person had the power on their own to say, I want to be a Cooper. Because it's always going to be facilitated by the overseer, the manager, who's typically a lawyer, and often the planter, if the planter is present. Because again, in a place like Jamaica, often the planters didn't move to the colonies. They stayed back in England or in Britain and did everything through correspondence. And it's the overseer on the ground who is, the head person facilitating all this. But no, absolutely, it's not the enslaved people who would have had that choice on where and what they wanted to do in terms of negotiating a position like that of the artisan classes.
So we move to our last theme, which is about the legacy of slavery. I have a short question there and a long question. I don't know how you want to move. Joseph, you want to ask first?
I could ask a question first, yes. We spoke about the importance of personal names. Maybe we could bring that to a modern context, particularly in the US, where we have these modern social justice movements where victims of violence and murder are not being forgotten. We see it every day when we hear the say my name or say their name. Mm-hmm. Do you see this as sort of a reclaiming of identity by modern Black people? Mm-hmm. Do you see this in any way as a sort of like in connection to the unnaming that was happening previously by the Black slave owners? By the white slave owners?
Sure. Yeah. I see it more in another way, Joseph. Like, okay, so I want to direct our attention to why we're even having to march to say someone's name, like say Mr. Floyd's name, say Ms. Breonna Taylor's name. And that is where you find the most profound connection to slavery and what has not changed in the supposed expendability and the insentience of Black people. And what I mean by that is that no cognizant human being with any feeling could have not perceived that Mr. Floyd was suffering under the knee of the ex-police officers. That wasn't a difficult call to understand that he was being murdered after almost 10 minutes. So for me, I think where the resonance is in terms of Black Lives Movements and slavery is that sadly, we are still living in a moment where there's too many white people and too many racist, systemically racist institutions who perceive Black people to still be insentient. And what I mean by that, literally here's the thing, in the period of slavery, white slave owners and others who were supporting slavery actually wrote treatises, wrote books, wrote letters about how they believe that Black people literally felt less than white people. So literally they would conceptualize why I have to whip the enslaved person 100 times is because literally their skin is thicker. And if I whipped a white person 10 times, they would actually feel it the same amount as if I whipped a Black person 10 times. And you have to understand that when we're talking about things like whipping, they were using the exact same whips that they'd use on animals, horses, cow, mule, donkey, that they'd use on a Black person. That ethic, that understanding, that falsehood is still pervasive, and we see it again and again in the constant excessive use of force that policing uses with Black people, right? The lack of the ability, and it's not the ability, let me rephrase that. The lack of the desire to de-escalate when the person on the other side of that incident or confrontation is a Black person, right? And listen, anybody with any intelligence goes, look, how many times have you ever heard of a situation go down between police and a white guy in the way that it went down with Chauvin and Floyd? Please tell me, please show me that. First of all, too, what we have to understand, the insentience of Black people too is also being expressed constantly in the fact that, you know, media outlets like CNN and others showed that video again and again with no regard to the fact that that was constantly re-traumatizing us as Black people who know that we are, in the minds of someone like Chauvin, interchangeable with Mr. Floyd. That there's no sense of the fact that we suffer in seeing our fellow Black people brutalized and murdered in that way. And again, please show me the incident where a white woman or a white man was murdered in that way, where they repeatedly show the video over and over and over and over and over and over again. They wouldn't do it. They haven't done it. Okay? So this is, I think, where the correlation is for me, more so than the naming. The naming is a mechanism to say, I'm not going to forget this person. And even that is futile, because listen, Mr. Floyd came to prominence for the horrific way that his execution was played out in public across 10 minutes with multiple camera angles. How many others' names do we not know? Does CNN and CTV and City TV not even mention, right? And then think about it. This is 2021 where gladly, I should say, the murder of someone like Mr. Floyd gets attention. Do we think this wasn't going on in the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, and 1960s? It wasn't news. No one thought it was news. Do you understand? Nobody thought it was news except for us. And then we weren't in any of these institutions that could broadcast that could bring that story of harm, of violence, of murder, of execution to the public, because we weren't on CTV and CBS and CNN. There was no Don Lemon, right? So this is the thing too that we have to understand. Why this landscape have changed in terms of us talking about this is because literally Black people and people of color and Indigenous people are now in positions of power where we can insist this is actually a story. This is, his murder is actually a story. But we still could see that we don't have enough power to say, excuse me, do you not want to play that anymore? Do you want to stop that? Do you want to understand that there's Black people, Black children, there's people watching that for whom that is traumatizing? So we still have a long way to go, I think, on that, Joseph.
I'll move to my long question because I think you answered part of the other one. This question is a general question pertaining to the legacy of transatlantic slavery. It's got a bit of a preamble, excuse me. Decades ago, a connection was made between the rigid caste system in India and the position of Black people in the American South. Martin Luther King himself, when he visited India and was taken to a school for untouchable kids in 1959, was introduced as Meet Martin Luther King, an untouchable from the United States of America. He was initially miffed, but he did recognize soon after that, yes, he and his people were certainly untouchables in their own country. In recent years, this theme has resurfaced with works such as that of Isabel Wilkerson in Caste in America. Moving to the present time, decades later, one question to you is, can one still draw parallels between the rigid, ingrained system imposed particularly on the bottom rung in India, and the hierarchy that is imposed on Black people as a consequence of transatlantic slavery? And the second part is that while the situation of the Dalits, who were the untouchables, has really not improved. The other classes there is mobility there and they've moved, but the Dalits are stuck in that place. Can one argue that for the Black population in North America, things have improved and there is some hope with movements such as Black Lives Matter?
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that, Shernaz. Okay, so I think part of how I want to answer this is by thinking through what colonization looks like for different groups of people, Indigenous people and different groups of people of color across the Americas. Now, I understand the desire to equate the so-called untouchables in India with the experience of Black people in a place like Canada or other Western countries. But to me, there's a fundamental distinction. I take it, this is not my area of study, but I take it part of the reasons the term untouchable was conceived is because literally these are people who other people felt were so dirty or so sullen or so subhuman that, abject, excuse me, that they were beyond human touch, that they should be shunned and kept separate and apart from the so-called elites or their so-called betters, right? Slavery did the opposite. That's what we have to understand. So when I think about someone like Bet and Belle and Lydia, who's running away with Jane, who might be James Fraser's child, what we need to think about is that, again, white people forced intimacy onto the Black people they enslaved. So yes, they saw my ancestors as inferior because of their Blackness, but they also then didn't, the end game wasn't to separate from the Black, it was to bring Black people, literally force people, Black people to live with them and to caretake every aspect of their personal lives and well-being, and to steal biologically from Black people, meaning through the mechanism, for instance, the practice of sexual coercion and rape. Literally, I think, like we got to think about this. Here's white people looking at Black people saying, you are not human, or you're subhuman, you're a thing, I can call you a chattel. And then what comes out of that is, I want to have sex with you. I want to make children with you. Like, do you see the absurdity of this? This is complete, like, it makes no sense. If you feel that the Black people are so dirty, brutish, etc., why are you handing your white children to them to raise? Like, literally, enslaved Black women in the domestic sphere were the mothers of white slave owner children, to the point of even giving their own breast milk. So it wasn't an untouchable, kind of conceptualization. It was, I see you as lesson, I see you as inferior, I see you as a thing, and therefore I hold you closer to me and force an intimacy on you, through which I control you, your biological, materials from your body. And I even have control over your sexual intimacies with me or with other people, right? Through a mechanism, through a practice, something like breeding, right? So literally, white slave owners are saying, you Black man look big and strong, and you Black woman look big and strong. The two of you, I forced you to have sex across your fertile years. Breeding often wasn't a one-off, right? I forced you to have sex across your fertile years to make big, strong babies for me. And don't let me see you partnering with the people you actually love, because that's not your choice, right? So yes, Untouchables works in the sense of being the abject, the rejected, the so-called bottom rung of a society, but it doesn't work in terms of the actual definition of the process of how those people were treated in India as being shunned and pushed away from mainstream society. It's the opposite with slavery, right? It's an enforced, what I call a perverse intimacy of white people forcing themselves constantly onto Black people at the same time that they're saying, you're beneath me, you're not me, you're literally a different species. Why are you having sex with, why are you trying to rape? Like, what? It makes no sense. So this is too why slavery was called the peculiar institution, because there's so many bedfellows in slavery then that are strange and make no sense. They just don't fit together. Right? If you unpick any one, you're like, this is a string that's going to unravel the whole thing. And you're wondering, why didn't it unravel the whole thing?
Just one point I wanted to add here. The Dalit women are certainly raped in large numbers. So there is that sexual intimacy there. But you're right. Certainly in the rural areas, the Dalit women wouldn't be touching or caring for the children, or certainly not breastfeeding the children of the other classes.
And would they be pulled into the household in the same way, like to actually live in the household, or no? Not necessarily.
In the urban areas, yes. In the urban areas, you don't see so much anymore, that literal separation. But in the rural areas, it certainly hasn't improved for it's about 18% of the population in India. So it hasn't improved for them.
Wow.
Then going to the next part.
Yes.
Do you see any future for the Black people?
So here's the thing. We're having a moment, in part because of the horrific, on-camera murder of Mr. Floyd. Black Lives Matter, because people have woken up in the pandemic to go, oh, who's dying of COVID? Oh, really? It's all these Black people, people of color. Why? Because often we're not the ones, like me, I'm so blessed, who can sit at home and my job is type. I don't have a public facing job that I can't escape, right? So who's being most detrimentally impacted by something like COVID? All these things have just come together at once and made it impossible for a lot of white people who looked away for a long time to be like, even I can't deny it anymore. This is horrific, right? And here's the thing though, what everybody needs to understand is people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, we knew this all the time. This was our lives, right? And we were saying it and shouting it loudly all the time. But part of it is now, part of the moment is, Shernaz, that people are saying, oh, they're looking around institutions like universities, like corporate boards, like university boards, like banking, like healthcare, and saying, where are the Black people, where are the Indigenous people, where are the people of color, right? And they're waking up the fact that Canada, of course, has systemic institutional racism in every dimension of every possible or conceivable, type of employment. Okay, it's there. So, but people are finally waking up to that. And with that, then there's going to be, of course, everybody and their mother has EDI policy now, right? Here's the thing, they always did have EDI policies, they were never enforced. And I could preach about this for days about McGill, okay? When I left McGill, there were 1,726 tenure and tenure track faculty, right? The most prestigious, the most desirable positions, 1,726. There were 10 of us who were Black. 10. I did not misspeak. There were 11 who were Indigenous. You have to work very hard at keeping us out to that level. That is like 0.5% Black people and 0.6% Indigenous people in the most prestigious categories. And McGill is McGill. If they want to go steal Henry Louis Gates Jr. from Harvard or Cornell West, they could give it a damn good try. It's McGill, right? They didn't do that either. So
it's never been known for being progressive.
I know, but here's the thing. McGill, sadly, is not alone in this. Check out U of T. Check out the landscape of academia is horrendous in Canada with the underemployment of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, but especially Black and Indigenous people. And why does that matter? Because when I stand at the front of class looking like I do and speak as someone with a PhD, the students sit up and go, oh, she can be a knowledge bearer too. Someone who looks like her, someone who is her, has something to say to me, right? With the authority of 3 degrees behind her name and 7 books behind her. Do you understand? So that transforms the experience for all of my students, as well as especially my white students and listen, I know this because I ask them, I say to them, how many of you are coming into my class who have ever had a Black teacher, professor, or person of authority in your life ever in this country? Can I tell you, their hands don't go up. No dentist, no doctor, no teacher, no coach, nothing. Mm-hmm. But what are these people doing? They're listening to Drake. They're listening to Beyonce. They're consuming Black popular culture. They have these fictitious ideas of Blackness in their head. And at the same time, on the ground, they know no Black people. Do you understand how dangerous that is? Yeah. So like, what does that mean? What kind of environment does that create? So to your point, a lot of progress being made in a very short period of time because white dominated races are under pressure, thank God, because none of this would be happening without the pressure. Let me just tell you that, right? This is happening for a reason at this moment because they don't have a choice anymore. But at the same time, listen, when my husband, who's African Latino, leaves the house, I say, what are the rules? And one of the rules is when he gets stopped, if he gets stopped by the police, he's not to have anything in his hands. Do people understand that that's not just a conversation that Black people have with their kids? Mm-hmm. Like that I am afraid for my big, beautiful, gorgeous, intelligent husband when he leaves the house without me, of how he's going to be surveyed and over-policed, right? And this is a man who was like, my husband's former job was not just a fireman, but a fireman who with a water rescue specialization who used to be thrown into the ocean to rescue people who were drowning, okay? He's a first responder. They don't care. Someone who sees him and sees Black man, according to their stereotypes, is gonna go after him in a way, right? And how many times have we seen that to the white racist or other racist police officer, the Black man with a phone in his hand, the phone becomes a gun, right? This is so Shernaz, there's a lot of great things happening, but in terms of policing, I am still afraid. I'm still afraid for myself and especially afraid for the Black men who I love, who are in my life, right? And we have to understand then that what will it take for that to change, where we can walk around and as Black people feel that the police are there to serve and protect us, right? I don't know many Black people when they see a police cruiser drive by are like, yay, the police are here. Like, who's that? Who's that Black person? That's a Black person who's completely devoid of any sense of history of racism and the intersection with policing in the past or today, right? When we see the police show up, we're like, why are they here, right? And what is going on? Like, we just moved into a beautiful house in Nova Scotia. And I'll just end here, but we're looking at each other. We put in our security system and we look at each other. We're like, you know, we should call the police and tell them that we live in this beautiful house. Because if the alarm ever goes off and the police get dispatched, they're not going to believe the owners. They're going to think that we're the ones who broke into the house. Do you understand? Show me the white couple who has to have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the white couple who has to have that conversation about who the police will think is a burglar and who's the owner? That's the reality of our lives. So yes, a lot of improvement in the aspects of what might get us killed, not nearly fast enough.
Thank you.
Thanks, Srinaz. Thank you, Joseph.
All right. Well, we're going to be turning it over back to Zoe for questions from the audience. But before we do, I really do want to thank you for not only taking the time to speak with us, Srinaz and I, but also for the really enlightening conversation we had.
Thank you both so much, and thank you for your wonderful questions. It's been a pleasure to get to know you and to have this time with you. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Wonderful. And thank you so much, you three. This was a wonderful interview to listen to. And I believe our audience is in agreement. There are quite a few questions and we won't be able to get to all of them. And so I've been trying to condense and merge and focus on topics that a lot of our audience members were very interested in.
Okay.
So I'll start with going back to the fugitive slave advertisements.
Sure.
There were some questions about the language used in them. For example, very frequently the word likely would be used to describe attributes of the fugitives.
Yeah.
And the idea that being born in Africa was an appealing attribute. Would people have, lied about that or, fudged the numbers a little bit when putting out an advertisement for the marketing appeal? And someone's, mentioned the one drop rule. How might that apply in this context?
Okay, thank you so much, Zoe. Okay, so the fugitive slave ads likely meant good looking, nice looking, okay? And you'll notice they use terms too that we don't quite use the same way, like well-shaped, meaning they have good, they have a nice body, they have good musculature. So you can see in the slave sale ads, often the point is what? Describe the enslaved person as strong, healthy. They're always healthy, and that's a lie because enslaved people had the highest mortality rates, of course, because they're being worked to death and brutalized. So but the owners are claiming they're strong, they're healthy, they're physically fit, and they're what? Obedient. Okay, so again and again and again, not just in Canada, in the Americas generally, but likely good looking or nice looking. So in terms of Africa, so with the person asking if the people would manipulate or lie about the person being not from Africa. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so here's the thing. I think for sure, that's a really insightful question. They may have tried, but I don't know if you could hide it when the potential new slave owner met the enslaved person from Africa, if there was someone who had been, depending on how long they were in a place like Quebec, Nova Scotia, et cetera, New Brunswick, had they lost their accents, for instance, right? So you can lie all you want, but when it comes time for the face-to-face, when the potential new slave owner gets to inspect, and it wasn't an inspection, like a physical inspection, like open your mouth, jog on the spot, all this nonsense, right? Because they're trying to verify, again, how healthy you are. They might ask the person to speak too. And if you've said they're Creole and out comes an African accent, that's over. That lie is done, right? So unless it was someone who was brought to Canada at a point where there's such a young age, who's then creolization process stripped them of that accent, then you could probably get away with it. But in that case too, I think some slave owners would surmise that so much of their time had been in slavery, in bondage in the Americas, that they may have lost some of that resistance that they assumed was so essential to Africans and Africanness, people born on the continent, okay, who remembered being free. Then that last part, Zoe, the one drop rule. Okay, so for people who don't know, this is the kind of idea in terms of the racism of biological racism, that to have one drop of so-called black blood was to make you black, and therefore you're impure, right? Because black, what we have to understand, slavery helped to construct blackness as a pathology that when mixed with other races degenerated the other races, right? So that's why we have this creation of this bizarre hierarchical nomenclature of blackness, which is, by the way, deeper in the tropical plantation regimes than in Canada. In Canada, the terms for blackness that I'm finding are Negro, Negro mulatto, and mulatto, period. In a place like Jamaica, they have a 6-tier naming, right? So Negro, there's a step between mulatto and Negro called Sambo, right? Then mulatto, then quadroon, then like I think musty, then mustafi, like, right? And when you're a Mustafino, which I think is like 16 great-great-grandparents, 1 is black, 15 are white, you're considered black if you don't look white. So good luck to you in a place like Jamaica where people know your ancestry, right? So when are you allowed to become white? And the thing is too, you have to think, when people are running away and they were light-skinned as enslaved people, and if they could pass as a free person and get away from their slave owner and make their way as a white person, they better not have kids, because the child could come out darker than you, right? We understand that, right? We should understand that. So then where are you going to go, and who's going to be your partner? If the partner is a white person, you better disclose to them, because that child might come out darker than you and expose the fact that you've been passing for white. So this is not an easy decision too for anybody in the period of slavery to, or later, to pass into whiteness, because then the different attributes physically expressed in your body of blackness might manifest in the subsequent generation, right? So all very complex, but yes, this one drop rule, I think, is definitely there in Canada. It's not articulate in the same way, but you see that they're still, Zoe, preoccupied with racial naming and racial hierarchy.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. So there was a lot of curiosity about topics that I think are neighboring to your current research, especially now that you're in Nova Scotia, and throughout your research, make references to Indigenous enslaved people as well. And so there were a few questions on this. I suppose I'll address them together just in the larger history of slavery in Eastern Canada. But pre-British occupation, what was the context of slavery in French Canada, and how Acadians were involved in that process, or early French settlers,
Right.
And then kind of connected to that, both across the board, I suppose, but back in Quebec, more particularly on Indigenous slaves, were they enslaved together beside African slaves? And someone had the question of, I think you mentioned someone who studies this particularly, the relationship between Black and Indigenous enslaved peoples, and they would like to know that person's name so that they can do more research.
Okay, sorry. I need to recuperate her name too, because she attended one of my lectures when I lectured at the in a university in the UK, UC College London, I think. And I tried to follow up to get her name, because I said, you need to come to the Institute. We need to give you some money. So yeah, please be in touch. I'll see if I can find her name for you. All right, so Indigenous enslaved people. All right, so in New France, which is then what Quebec was called prior to 1760, there is a lot of documentation, manuscript, not printed. There was no printing press. So here's the thing. There are no slave sale, fugitive, and auction ads for New France, because they didn't have a printing press. So here's the interesting thing though. Of course, people were still running away. of course, people were still being sold. So what was the mechanism, for instance, to try to catch a runaway? And I think what it was is something that still happened in places where they're oppressed, like Quebec post 1760. The Quebec Gazette, I think, was founded in 1764. Is that slave owners would write to other slave owners in other regions that were proximate to where they thought the enslaved person was running and say, heads up, someone just ran away, please look for them, and please have the militia, the jailer, the sheriff also look for them, right? And that was an obligation of the state, if you were employed by the state, to help to hunt for and recapture and throw the person where? In a workhouse or the jail. Okay, so we would, and people have, I think, found that documentation in New France, but not in a printed form. Whereas we'll find all of it, the letters and the printed ads, in Quebec, because they had a printing press, and we have the Montreal Gazette and the Quebec Gazette started both in the period of slavery, and also I think Quebec Herald comes along in the period of slavery. In terms of so-called more abject or diminished European ethnicities like Acadians, Irish people, Jewish people, sadly, some of them were also slave owners. You can see that Judah Joseph, who owned Chloe, was a Jewish man, right? So at the same time, here's the thing that's sad. White people being oppressed by the people who created a hierarchy of whiteness exists too at this time, right? So in Britain, what does it look that look like? English people think they're better than everybody, then the Scottish, then the Welsh, then the Irish. So the Irish are most typically the indentured people, the indentured servants who are being shipped out to places like Barbados and also places like Canada. But they are, of course, considered an abject form of whiteness for a period when they're relinquished, when they're released from their indentureships in a place like Barbados. They were given land and or freedom dues, meaning money. So the Irish had an accelerated pathway into citizenship and into a higher type of whiteness, whereas to be enslaved and to be Black, I should point out, there's no way out of slavery. You're a slave for life. The only way to escape slavery is to die, be killed, to run away, or to be freed. And it attaches to your children. If you're a Black man and you have sex with an enslaved woman, your children are enslaved because she's enslaved. If you're a Black man, you have sex with a free person, then the children are free because she's free. But for an enslaved woman, your children are always going to be born enslaved. So that's something we have to understand. There was no way out for enslaved people as there were for Acadians, Irish, Jewish people who might have been indentured in the beginning at different points, or who were definitely oppressed. But we have to understand indentureship was not slavery. Indentureship was a work contract where you're bound out to a specific employer for a period of years who had to feed and clothe you and put a roof over your head. So of course, those employers were often brutal and tried to abuse people, but there were limits to how much you could abuse, especially a white free person under the law, compared to an enslaved Black person who was considered property. That's why there's so many incidences of white slave owners executing, like murdering enslaved people, because that was their right to do so, because the enslaved person was not considered a human. So no one's going to come for you, right? There's no recourse for that enslaved person's family in that system. Now, in terms of Indigenous enslaved people in New France and Quebec, what we have to understand is we have Indigenous people and Black people enslaved in the same households. And sometimes a scholar, there's one scholar, I'm gonna forget her name here. Anyway, who's written a book, and she was arguing that she thought that she could assess some types of preferences across the ethnicity of whites in terms of whether they prefer to buy Black people or Indigenous people. Other people have debunked that. But what we know for sure from the brilliant scholarship of Marcel Trudel, who was writing about Quebec and New France slavery in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, my friends. He left us a good, cache of books to dig into. Marcel Trudel, who taught at Laval. He did the statistical analysis and determined that in 1759, right at the point of British conquest, enslaved Indigenous people were dying on average at the age of 17, and enslaved Black people at 25. And that was because enslaved people of African descent had a greater resistance to European diseases like smallpox. So here's the thing, enslaved Indigenous people weren't even making it out of what we today called teenage years. Mm-hmm. So this, of course, too, would have impacted who white people were buying, because they would have understood, looking around them, who was dying in the epidemic or in the pandemic. the Black people somehow are lasting longer, living longer than the Indigenous people. So that for sure influenced it. And there's some indication that Black people, because of that, were priced higher because they had longer mortalities. And check this out, because they were foreign initially, they were positioned or seen as exotic to Canada. So there's a sense of like, this exoticism attached to them, especially then you have a lot of white enslavers deliberately using Black people in the domestic sphere, for instance, to serve them at their dinner parties when they're having, guests over, because of the exotic nature of the idea of being able to possess an object, right, from out there, from Africa or from the Caribbean. So that too shifted the price of Black people compared to Indigenous people. But I want to point out people like James McGill, who was not just a fur trader, he was a West Indian merchant shipping in rum, sugar, and molasses into Montreal. So actively exploiting enslaved people in places like the Anglo-Caribbean, Barbados, Jamaica, etc. He was also slave owner in Montreal, who enslaved both Indigenous children. 2 of them died before, I think, the age of 14, and Black people. And interestingly, in his case, Zoe, there's clear indication that he first was enslaving Indigenous people, and then he switched and started enslaving Black people. So there you got to wonder, does he make a calculation about the longevity and the mortality rates of the people he's enslaving when he then all of a sudden starts to enslave Black people?
Definitely. On a similar topic, I guess we were wondering, so in the article that we read for today, you mentioned that a lot of the fugitive slave advertisements in the archives kind of go up to the cusp of the 19th century, even though slavery in British Empire ended much later than that. And so could you describe that period in between the first half of the 19th century, I suppose, what the archives look like in that period, or conversely, maybe why you chose to focus on the earlier section?
Okay, well, in Quebec, I think Frank Mackey, he has a great book called Done with Slavery, Done, and that's McGill Queen's Press, 2010, Frank Mackey. So he has done the tremendous job of collecting a lot of these fugitive ads, slave sale, auction, and the fugitive ads, actually. And he actually, from that data, I think he argues that the last slave sale and fugitive ad printed in Quebec were from 1798. So slavery was, I think, starting to die out on its own in terms of not necessarily being economically wise for the slave owners, not because they'd had an epiphany in terms of race relations, but because they were making an economic calculation whether or not it paid off to own someone and exploit them in that way if you got enough labor out of them and actually in order to justify their upkeep. Okay, but there are, I think, a couple ads for escaping Black indentured servants, Zoe, that go into the early, I think, 19th century. And Black people also were indentured and often forced into a position to have to indenture themselves because of the racism of the labor force and employment, in terms of white people not allowing them access to certain jobs or paying them in a way that they could sustain themselves without indenturing themselves to a white person. So I think what we find, though, is, here's the thing. When we study slavery, you always have to hone in on the specific dates of the region that you're looking at. So in Canada, because Canada was a British possession or British colony, our date of abolition is 1834 because an act was passed through British Parliament in London, England, forcing everyone to stop practicing transatlantic slavery in 1834 everywhere in the British Empire. So Canadians didn't stop slaving of their own accord, the people who were here at the time, regardless of their backgrounds. They stopped because the British made them stop. In the USA, we're dealing with 1865 as the end of the Civil War and the North winning. Therefore, the South had to stop slaving. The North had already abolished slavery. And yes, there was slavery in the American North. They just abolished it earlier. And then in the Spanish Empire is a different date, Portuguese Empire, Netherlands, Denmark, etc. So we always have to be aware of that. Now, whether or not you have the printed document depends on whether they're a printing press on the ground in a specific colony at a given time. But you will almost always end where you find slave owners, or when you find enslaved people, find the written or the manuscript documents like the bills of sale, the estate inventories, the wills, the personal correspondence, the business correspondence, the business ledger. You will always find that if they were preserved. And so here's a trick too. When I'm looking for these documents, I look in Canadian archives, like provincial archives are in charge of wills and estate inventory. So John Roth's estate inventory I showed you, I found at the Nova Scotia Provincial Archives. But also, why do I travel to Britain and go to the British Library? Because a place like the British Library has documentation, manuscript and printed on everywhere the British colonized, including Canada, including Jamaica, including Barbados, etc. So someone working on the Spanish Empire might have to travel to the Dominican Republic and go to Spain, depending on what they're looking for, okay? Because some of the archives were sent back to the mother country and some were left in the colonies.
Thank you. I think stepping back a little bit to overall your research project as it is, someone from the USA is wondering why do not only Americans but Canadians themselves, why do we know so little of the history of slavery in Canada? I know it's a big question, but
Well, that's a great question.
yeah, what
yeah, that's such a great
to an American, I suppose.
No, that's great. So of course, so here's the thing. Americans and the rest of the world knows nothing about slavery in Canada because Canadians know nothing about slavery in Canada. And again, I'm not joking. There's about 5 people like myself who are employed at a university, who have a job, who are tenured or tenure track, who routinely publish, usually academic work. But again, like I write for Walrus, for instance, right? So I try to disseminate more broadly, but who routinely publish on Canadian slavery. Can I tell you, we don't have time to go through the list of names of people working on South Carolina, Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, Jamaica, Haiti. Okay, we don't have time to talk about that, the plethora of literature being generated on those places. And so here's the bias within transatlantic slavery is that scholars have typically equated transatlantic slavery means what? Tropics or semi-tropics, means plantation, means sugar, cotton, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what has been understudied, ignored, and quite frankly, erased, right? To the point where, like, literally, I'd had students at McGill across the 17 years from America who were shocked when I started to talk about slavery in a place like Pennsylvania. They're like, what are you talking about? Pennsylvania never had, it's like, they know nothing. My American students knew nothing about slavery in the American North. The Canadians knew nothing about slavery anywhere in Canada, right? In 17 years, I had one Canadian student say, yes, when I asked the question, who comes to this class knowing that slavery transpired in Canada? One student in 17 years said yes. And when I said to that student, please share with us, I was so excited, please share with us the content that you received. There was no content. The teacher said to them, slavery happened in Canada, and then went on to teach about a tropical plantation site of slavery. And you cannot blame the teacher because you cannot teach what you've never learned. So how are these wonderful teachers who are now reaching out to me saying, help us, we want to teach this, we want to stop always enshrining and praising ourselves and patting ourselves on the back for the Underground Railroad every time that Black History Month rolls around, because that's the only time we get to talk about Black Canadians in February, right? But what do we roll out in February is the Underground Railroad. They don't want to do that. They don't know how, because there's no curriculum for them. Right, so that's one of the priorities of the Institute, is to help build that curriculum so that these wonderful teachers can do something different. But thank you for that question. Here's the thing I just want to reiterate. You see all the documents, it's the tip of the iceberg that I'm sharing with you. There's no dearth in the archive. In the Canadian archives about Canadian slavery, or in archives in Britain about Canadian slavery, the documentation is there. Why? Slave owners were unashamed to hold people in bondage. In the period of slavery, they just thought that was normal. They were just superior. That's just how things were. Blacks were just inferior. They wrote it down. Why? Because to have an enslaved person was to have a piece of property, and you document your property. So it's all there. The problem is who's looking at it. And you can see from what I'm trying to show you, it's not enough to just stumble upon the estate inventory or stumble upon the ledger. You have to know how to read it. You have to know how to interpret it, what you're looking for. You have to know then, as a scholar of slavery studies, you're never really looking for a birth certificate because enslaved people weren't given birth certificates. You have to know there's a whole register of documents you're looking for that you wouldn't look for if you were doing research on a free person. So there's training, obviously, that has to go into even who can do the research and how to do the research. So until we get more students and more people like myself, you know, and more artists and more filmmakers focusing on Canadian slavery, we're going to live with this falsehood where we, you know, again, want to pat ourselves on the back. And can I just point out, Underground Railroad, 31 years, right? 1834, British abolished slavery, end of the American Civil War, 1865, 31 years. Do you see how hypocritical we are in Canada? We've enshrined, we celebrate, we want to teach 31-year history and totally obliterate 200 years? Really? How do you pull that off? It takes work. And part of it, to your answer too, is what I should say at the top. Right after slavery ended, you have a group of mainly white male historians who go to work trying to rework slavery and put a benevolent spin on it. To say the nonsense like fewer enslaved people meant better treatment. And white slave owners in Canada had to be more benevolent because we're Canadians. Like all that kind of nonsense, they started to write that right after slavery ended. And of course, in that period, who was a professor, who was a scholar, who was a writer? White men. There were not white women, there were not people of color, there are certainly not enslaved descendants who got to look in there. So they took hold of that and they made themselves a kind of canon of nonsense that today we're still pushing back against, right? So that's part of it too, that the early people, actually early scholars, I put that in quotes and it needs to be in quotes, they actually were actively lying about Canadian slavery if they were writing about it at all. And then after them was a group of people actually really just denying that Canadian slavery ever happened. So not until you get to someone like William Rennett Riddell writing in the 1920s, you actually have a scholar of merit saying, look at these documents. Like this guy was writing in the 1920s and 30s, and he was analyzing future slave ads. God bless him. He was like alone in the wilderness. And then Marshall Trudell comes like 1960s. And then you have to wait seriously till the 80s to have someone like James Walker, who just retired from Waterloo. And now you have like a handful of us like myself and George Eliot Clark at U of T, et cetera, who are doing the work. But again, I'm not joking, there's about 5 of us.
All right, thank you. Oh, I need to turn a light on. One moment. All right, thank you. So there are actually quite a few questions on something that Professor Nelson, you were talking about in bits and pieces, but the issue of Black women and gender and sexuality and how that interacts with how they were treated as enslaved people. And someone has the question, let's see, yeah, how does this view of Black women, either enslaved or otherwise, as exotic or sexual objects, and the negative affect that comes from those stereotypes, rooted in the history of slavery. Can you articulate a little bit the just how that's affected Black women in the history of, or the legacy of racism and slavery? I suppose to narrow it down in Canada, Quebec.
For sure. Oh my gosh. Well, a lot of this, that's a great question. And a lot of it, what I would have to say about Quebec and Canada also just has to do with the burden that we as Black women in diaspora and continental Africans have inherited from our enslaved foremothers in terms of their sexual brutalization. And I say to my students at McGill too, I'm like, listen, I'm not going to give you a trigger warning every week. Transatlantic slavery was a horror show, and I'm sorry, but if you can't stay with the material, then you shouldn't take the class. But I'm not going to sanitize it for you, because to do so is an affront to what the ancestors suffered. But a lot of what they suffered, especially enslaved women, was sexual violence. And let me just break this down for you so you understand, because there's different practices and different methods of controlling the fertility and the sexuality of Black people. I should point out off the top too that Black males were also the targets of white male and white female sexual violence. That's little understood, not much talked about, and very understudied. But both white men and women preyed on Black men sexually, right? And you can see how easy that would be too, especially for a white woman who's in the position of authority of an enslaver, to say, listen, you're going to sleep with me, or I'm going to tell people that you raped me. Pick. But because for him to pick the latter means he's going to get executed. Okay. And we have a whole history of lynching in the USA and other places that affirm that even way after slavery, that was still going on. Right. And we're at the moment of commemorating the Tulsa massacre. So we understand the reality of that. Okay. But in terms of enslaved women and females, we have to understand that part of sexual violence was just the one-off rape. Part of it, the practice, was actually a breeding practice. And again, breeding could look like you are going to make babies from me. Okay, it could look like that, and the planter or the overseer thinks and did enforce that coupling across years. And think of the suffering of those two people often. And to Shanaz's earlier question, because we have the testimonies of enslaved people in their own words from places like the United States, we understand that enslaved people often then were forcibly separated from their chosen mates by the owner, the slave owner, and the overseers, and then forced to couple with someone they were like, who are you? Right? And that was enforced, right? There was punishment if you didn't do that, right? And again, punishment, like for instance, you see your baby, do you want your baby to end up in a plantation 2 states over? Choose, okay? As well as corporal punishment, et cetera, et cetera. So breeding could look like that. It also looked like Matthew Lewis, owner of 2 plantations in Jamaica, who kept a breeding list tracking the fertility of enslaved females on his plantations. So tracking when they were menstruating, when they could become pregnant, all that kind of stuff, and creating a kind of system of honor to incentivize them to want to participate in breeding. How? He gave all the mothers who had living children a red girdle, and for each child, a silver coin was attached to the girdle. Do you understand this? Now, here's what we have to think. If your life is endless drudgery, backbreaking labor, not enough food, corporal punishment, no leisure time, who's the enslaved person is not going to say, okay, I'll take that deal? Because you say you're going to give me more food, right? You say you're going to give me more leisure time. And I understand that even if I resist you, you're still going to somehow find a way to rape me, right? So what I want to express here is that there's a reason why many scholars of transatlantic slavery, like myself, we've gotten to the point of saying the term agency does not belong in a discussion of enslaved people's lives. They did not have agency. It's a series of bad choices, and enslaved people were constantly having to figure out what is the least of the bad or horrific choices, if you get me. So breeding also looked like Matthew Lewis's plan, but we see resistance in this. How? He's writing in his journal when he gets to Jamaica. He doesn't understand why all these women are miscarrying or losing their children. He doesn't understand that they're practicing abortion as a form of resistance through herbal remedies, right? That are being passed down from grandmother to daughter, from aunt to cousin, etc. But he knows something's going awry, but he doesn't know what it is. Another thing we know that enslaved Black women and females did, they extended the lactation because they understood that they couldn't get pregnant again if they weren't ovulating. They didn't use the terminology then, but they understood that to extend your lactation was to delay the ability to get pregnant again. So they'd often go to the overseer and argue with the overseer about, no, we want the right to breastfeed our children longer. And of course, the Europeans didn't understand that to do that was to delay their ability to get pregnant again. Okay, so the resistance to is everywhere visible. But I think then to the greater point, coming forward into the present again, like, listen, we're still as Black women living with a lot of these stereotypes that have nothing to do with how we present ourselves in the public or in our private lives, that have to do with white projections onto our bodies that have an expectation of our hypersexualization. Okay, and because of that too, excuse me, one of the detrimental impacts of that is that Black communities and Black people impose these types of respectability politics on themselves and each other, which try to police our sexuality within the community because we are so attuned to white racism, positioning us in stereotypes or depicting us in stereotypes of hypersexualization or lascivity, sexual deviance. So what is our response to that then, right? So I often say to my students, I have this conversation, you know, with myself all the time, what does a healthy Black sexuality look like? Coming out of 400 years of slavery, what does that even look like, right? Because you have 400 years of slavery meant that Black people did not have the ability to control their own sexuality. So what does a healthy sexuality look like when you emerge from that? When you have been conditioned, for instance, as a Black man to think that your value is in how many babies you can make, not in how many babies you father and parent. What does that actually look like, right? So there's a reason why we have some of the problems in our Black communities today, because of 400 years of oppressive projection from white communities onto us. And can I just say, this is sexually lascivious ones clearly in the period of slavery were the white people, especially the white men, who were at the same time accusing Black communities and Black people of being sexually lascivious and deviant, while they were routinely creating multiple mixed race families and the white family across multiple, often plantation holdings. So the white men were the polygamists. Okay, at the same time they were accusing Black people of being sexually lascivious, they were the ones, a la Thomas Jefferson, would be sexually coercing and raping Black women and trying to maintain the proper white wife and the white legitimized descendants. Okay, so we have to be clear on that as well, in terms of so-called sexual deviance, who the actual culprits were.
Yeah, thank you. I'll put in one last question that's merging a couple of questions from the audience on to do with your background as an art historian and your research at NSCAD. So let's see. Could you speak a little bit to the importance of communication and communication through art and poetry, etc., in this work? A, and then B, where did it go? Oh, there it went. B, what images, art or role models of Black individuals might you like to leave the audience with today?
Oh boy, great question. Great questions all evening. Thank you all so much for attending and for your wonderful contributions. Okay, so the first one in terms of the art. So again, yeah, thank you for allowing me to end on this note, Zoe. So I want to just say as well, in the first cohort that we're now looking for at NSCAD, we're offering fellowships to 2 artists in residence and 2 MA fellows who are in their thesis year, any discipline and any nationality. So please, if you know anybody, please direct them to the website and have them, encourage them to apply. But why the art is so important too, I'll go back to a scholar who really inspires me, Marcus Wood, who actually is an artist, but also an esteemed art historian of this subfield of transatlantic slavery that we call the visual culture of slavery. So it's mainly art historians who look at transatlantic slavery through the lens of art and visual culture. So he's talked in his book, Blind Memory, about the fact that, you know, the individual life of any one enslaved person is irrecuperable. And you can see why. You know, you can argue the life of any historical individual, free or enslaved, was irrecuperable. But when you talk about enslaved people, it's just like, it's not going to happen. Trying to build a biography of, let's say, Thursday is I think, a necessary practice, but it's futile for me to think that it will ever be complete. again, because why I'm looking at her through documents left by John Rock and or John Bishop, who owned her, who only ever wanted to represent her in a partial way as an object that they owned. So that, and Marcus Wood talks about slavery as an entity and institution being beyond representation. You can't represent the Middle Passage. You can't represent what it felt like for enslaved people to be treated like cargo, brought onto a slave ship naked, shackled one to another, held in spaces where they couldn't sit up even for a voyage that might have been 6, 7, 10 weeks, where there's, I'm sorry, but vomit, urine, menstrual blood. First of all, who survives that? Who survives that? Who survives that to, let me shut this up. Who survives that to go on to have the next generation of children, right? And who survives that mentally, right? What was it like to make it off the slave ship on the other side of the Americas and have a living memory of that terror? And we often understand then that people who go through traumas, how they deal with their traumas is by not speaking about the trauma. And that's how the next generation learns about the trauma, is what grandmother never talked about. Not what grandmother or grandfather talked about, what they would never talk about. So what is the knock-on transgenerational impact of that trauma? Now, why do I say all that about Marcus Wood? So who's going to tell these histories and these stories? The artists are the perfect people to try to even attempt to reclaim, to recuperate, to represent, however futile, this work. Because there's a limit to what I can do. Here's the thing. There's a limit to what I can do as a art historian, which I think is necessary though. I think part of my job is to point out in my writing and in my teaching what I can't figure out and what is irrecuperable in the archive, because there's a gap or a hole in the archive. But if you go to someone like Lawrence Hill, right, or novelists, they will fill in that gap by fictionalizing that. That also is important because they can surmise by patching together or reading about, here's Frederick Douglass, here's Mary Prince, here's this other people. I'm going to read, 50 fugitive slave narratives, and I can come up with an idea of what happened in this 10-year gap of that enslaved person's life. That is also seismically important, but I think the two of us have to exist. The person who points at the gap and the person's like, I'm going to try to fill in that gap creatively. And that could be the play, that could be the film, that could be the painting, that could be the textile artist who wants to recuperate. Joe's wearing moccasins. Bet has an Indian shawl on. Let me work with the fabric of enslaved people's clothing and try to do something there. That's where my art resides. So you can see that the possibilities are endless. And I think though the most provocative and evocative outcomes will be from the artists. And the artists are always the ones who reach the people who would never crack open the academic book, right? So many people will go to the art exhibition and watch the film who won't read my books. And I get it, right? But so that's why they are so important too, because they'll reach a more diverse and a distinct audience. And Zoe, the second part of that was what again? Sorry.
Oh, what images or names or art
Yes.
what might you like to leave people with tonight?
Oh, great. Okay, so maybe we'll go back to something came up, I think, when I was talking to Shernaz about the fugitive slave, the literary genre of the fugitive slave narrative. So right now I'm reading a book by William McFeely that's about Frederick Douglass, but here's the thing. Frederick Douglass is Frederick Douglass. I've never come across another enslaved person who self-liberated. So Douglass, for people who don't know, how do you, okay, let me, Frederick Douglass in 1 minute, which is not possible. Born into slavery in Maryland, frees himself by pretending to be a free Black sailor in Baltimore when he's rented out. And yes, slaves were rented. Enslaved people were rented. He's rented out. He learns the different trades of ship making, and then he passes himself off as a free Black sailor. He becomes literate, teaches himself to read and write largely, but he was given some lessons at the knee of a kindly slave mistress who did not dismiss him when she was teaching her white son how to read. Okay, dangerous. Okay, so Douglass learned how to read and write while listening to the white kids' lessons. Okay, goes on to further become what? Statesman, abolitionist orator, newspaper owner and editor. Douglass is a reason that Lincoln allowed Black men to fight in Civil War on the side of the North. That's Douglass. Okay, Douglass convinced Lincoln. All right, Douglass left us 3 autobiographies. 3. That's unheard of. This is, you understand how crazy this is, Zoe? Most enslaved people don't even leave us a sentence, a paragraph. Douglass writes 3 stories of his own life. So he's a must for anybody who wants to understand slavery and slavery in America. The other thing about Douglass is people argue, various scholars, that Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century, not the most photographed African American, the most photographed American. Why is this important? Douglass understood the power of the democratizing effect of photography. Why? Suddenly there was a technology where Black people could go, hey, I have $10. I can go into the studio and represent myself. Prior to that, the 400-year archive of art and visual culture of slavery was white people misrepresenting Black people. That's what it is in the oil painting, the watercolor, and the print. It's white people's perceptions of us in a world where they weren't letting Black people into their segregated art schools. Then photography happens and Black people, free and enslaved, can go, I can do this myself. So Douglass was no fool. He took tons of pictures of himself because he understood the power of him showing the world what he wanted to look like. He was a patron of his own likeness. So Douglass, number 1. Number 2, Mary Prince. Mary Prince is the only, sadly, the only fugitive slave narrative we have from an enslaved woman who lived in the Caribbean. And she is, the tale she tells, her life story is so extraordinary because she disclosed so much, because she was enslaved and born in Bermuda, which is often not thought of again. What are the places we never think of when we think of transatlantic slavery? Bermuda. And then she was forced to go to Turks Island and to Antigua before she was taken by her slave owners to Britain and escaped to some abolitionists who, because she was illiterate, transcribed her story. So of course, listen, you always have to read fugitive narratives with a grain of salt, because if the white people were not transcribing, they were often editing what the Black people said. And typically what's edited out was sexual violence, because they were trying to protect the white female readers. Do you get this? This was their priority. How do we not harm the white women who are going to read this book? So it gets excised. The horror of the sexual violence typically gets excised out of all of these books, because they're so mindful that white women were a large part of the abolitionist movement. But Mary Prince alludes to it again and again and again, the abhorrent, sexually coercive and violent behavior of the white men that owned her. And she tells this harrowing tale too that actually opens up different dimensions of enslaved labor, things like enslaved people not having access to rituals of the church, even though at the same time they're being forcibly Christianized, right? You, as an enslaved person, you weren't allowed to decide to go up and go get married. That wasn't your right to do that, because you're not a human being. That was something you had to get authorized by the slave owners to do. So she gets married and she catches hell for it, right? So she talks about things like that and different types and practices of labor, like salt mining. Like, who knew, right? Because again, we think Caribbean, we think sugarcane and coffee. She's mining salt with enslaved people side by side in a place where they're being given corn, only corn to eat. And the obscenity of the fact is too that they're being made to actually grind up and make their corn into food at the end of a day's labor too, right? So when you think of the undifferentiated diets and all that, she covers all of it. So Mary Prince is extraordinary for the detail, for the nature of the different dimensions that she talks about in slavery, for the different landscapes and regions that she is able to speak to, because she was enslaved in multiple Caribbean islands. And for as in Douglass too, for the fact that she lived to tell her own tale, and survived slavery in the end. So those are two, absolutely, and they're readily available, Douglass and Mary Prince. Yeah. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for staying for a few more minutes. I couldn't help but ask one more question.
Yeah.
So I think that brings us to a close for this evening. I wanted to, of course, thank very, very much Charmaine Nelson for being here and for speaking with us. And thanks to Shernaz Chaksi and Joseph Pietri for this wonderful interview. Thanks to the interview committee for their work this year on planning this exciting suite of webinars that responds both to our own programming as well as to the interest of participants who listed these topics in their suggestions on earlier webinars. And thanks, of course, to our listeners for your attention and for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to even half of them, but they were wonderful. Thank you for your feedback that we hope to receive in the next week. Tomorrow you'll receive an email with the link to the recording of this event, as well as a survey asking for your feedback and for your other interests. And thanks also to Morgan Gagnon, who's our former promotions manager, for volunteering to help me behind the scenes today. Thanks to everybody.
And Zoe, can I just throw out, if people want to learn more, I have a research website where I list a lot of resources that are easy to watch. So often they're videos or links to museums and exhibitions and things. One word, blackcanadianstudies.com. Okay, and you'll find a whole bunch of resources if you want to keep learning. So thank you again, Zoe. Thank you, Joseph and Shernaz. Yeah.
And that's great. I will put the URL in the email that everybody gets tomorrow, just as an additional resource. And just one last note, furthermore, the Thomas More Institute is a not-for-profit charitable organization. And to support our mission and our programming, including webinars like this one, we'd appreciate any donations. You can visit our website, thomasmore.qc.ca, to read more information about us and what your donation will support. Thank you all so much for coming. Have a wonderful evening. Enjoy your weekend and happy summer. And Joseph, Shernaz, and Charmaine and Morgan, I will write to you shortly.
Bye-bye, Charmaine. That was a wonderful interview. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Thank you all. Thank you all for attending. Thank you.
Hope we
Bye.
get soon.
Bye. Good night,
Bye-bye.
everybody.